Section 15, the Four Noble Truths. So here we start, there's sort of two aspects to this section, and Sangharakshita starts off with pointing out the difference between method and doctrine. So from the point of view of doctrine, samsara is far away and nirvana is near. It's using a kind of logical form of reason, a priori form of reason, which is deductive, which means that you start off with the general principle or the underlying principle, and then you, from that underlying principle, you work out specific examples. So I have it in my notes. I can't remember who wrote this passage in my notes. It wasn't me, but I quite like it, which is really, this is the Buddha talking to himself. So doctrine is where the Buddha is working out something for himself. He's looking at the nature of the kind of general formula of things, trying to formulate in his own mind the general formula, which he then applies to specific examples. And with method, it's based on experience, and then working up to define what the underlying principle is behind our experience. So you start off with a specific, and you work up to the principle that makes sense of it all, really. So that's a posteriori reasoning, which means from experience, sort of making a general principle out of our experience. It's inductive, and from that point of view, samsara is near and nirvana is far. And Sangharakshita says, well, this is what the Buddha does most of all. He's trying to use specific examples and then help us work out the underlying principle behind them. And I think this is an important difference to try and work out in our own experience, because sometimes it makes sense of what happens in study groups. So in study groups, you have some people who really like to focus on their experience first, really get to grips with their experience, and then work out the overriding principle, try and make sense of their experience through understanding the kind of truth behind it, the universal truth behind it. And then you also get times when we've got the universal truth as described in the Buddhist teaching, and we have to bring it down to our experience, work out how it applies to our experience. So that's the more kind of deductive reasoning, working from what the general principle is in the Dharma, and then working out what it means in our experience. Whereas the inductive way round of reasoning is you start off with your experience and then you get a general principle from it. And both are really important. This is the key. Both are really important. I've really seen that in my experience of working in study groups. I tend to move myself from the deductive end. So I tend to sort of want to know what the Buddha said. And then I have a bit of a journey to make to work out what that means in my experience. And friends of mine find that very frustrating. They say, Vajratara, you're really, really abstract. What does that mean in your experience? And so they help me make that journey from, what the Buddha said, the doctrine, to my experience. And hopefully I'm of some help to them too, because hopefully what happens is they start off with their experience and I say, well, yes, but what does your experience mean? What can you derive from your experience? What can you understand from your experience as a general principle? What kind of dharmic truth can you glean from what's going on with you right now? And help them make the journey from their experience to a universal principle, to understanding the kind of dharmic truth behind it. In a way, I don't think it really matters which end you start from. We all need to make that journey. We need to make that journey from universal truths to specific experiences, and from specific experiences that we have to universal truths. Otherwise, we get stuck in our experience and there's kind of no way out, or there's nothing to make sense of it. Whereas if we get stuck in the universal truth, then we get stuck in an abstract idea that doesn't have any relation to our actual experience. So we all need to make that journey within a study group, and that's why study groups are so helpful, because we can help each other make that journey. But the reason that Sangharakshita's talking about the difference between method and doctrine is that he wants to help us understand the significance of the Four Noble Truths. So when I was at school, my first encounter with Buddhism was a monk who came to our school and told us in a prepared speech that he had, which he obviously used repeatedly, he told us as a load of 17-year-olds that all life was suffering. And I just thought, well, this is a load of rubbish. I didn't see anything in Buddhism at all, because I just thought, well, you know, I did experience suffering in my life at the age of 17, but I was hoping that it would get better from there on in. I had a bit more of an optimistic wish that maybe it wasn't that all life was suffering, maybe there was a possibility for happiness as well. So I really wrote off Buddhism at that time. And it would have been very different for me if my first introduction to Buddhism, if someone had said, the Buddha takes a specific experience, which is an experience of suffering, which is important to us and helps us to make sense of that. I think that would have been a completely different way in, and I would have been much more interested, because I did have an experience of suffering and I did want to make sense of it. So when we talk about the Four Noble Truths, we're talking about a specific formula of praticca samutpada that's applied to a specific experience, which is dukkha or suffering. If we look at our specific experience of suffering, we can work out that general principle of praticca samutpada. We can work out that general formula. But that general formula of praticca samutpada is also applied to other things throughout the Pali Canon. Sangharakshita uses the example of food, but there are others. There is a chapter in the Sutta Nipata where he uses that formula to a number of different examples. So it's a method, just as focusing on the loathsomeness of the human body is not saying the human body is loathsome. It's saying that this is a method to look at one's experience and come out with a general principle of anatta, of there's no fixed or separate selfhood, there's no source of ultimate satisfaction found within the body. And this is important, I think, to recognise, because a lot of those examples that are used in the Buddhist literature about the female body, so it's not saying that there's something inherently ugly about the female body, it's used as a method to help usually a male monk reflect on anatta, and that there's no satisfaction, ultimate satisfaction to be found in the human body. But, you know, we can all use that method if we're caught in extreme forms of craving. You know, we can use that as a method to reflect on anatta and no reality, no ultimate reality, no ultimate satisfaction to be found within the samsara, which is the general principle. So yes, it's definitely not saying there's something inherently unsatisfactory about a female body compared to a male body, which is somehow some feminist commentators take it. So yeah, so we're looking at the Four Noble Truths as an application of praticca samutpada applied to this very, very pertinent and important existential question for us all, which is the existence of suffering. And Bhante really gives us an evocation of suffering. More than anything else, he's evoking what that experience is like, and he goes through three forms of suffering. He goes through the suffering of the actual sort of direct experience of the kind of Vedana of suffering, of dukkha Vedana, of being, you know, united with the unloved and separated from the love, of birth and sorrow and grief and lamentation and despair. And those really beautiful passages where the Buddha is talking about, you know, what is more, the tears, the flood of tears which weeping and wailing you have shed upon this long way, hurrying and hastening through the rounds of rebirth, united with the undesired, separated from the desires. This are the waters of the four oceans. And thus have you long time undergone suffering, undergone torment, undergone misfortune, and filled the graveyards full. Truly long enough to be dissatisfied with all the forms of existence, long enough to turn away and free yourselves from them all. So yes, so there's a reflection on actually the experience of suffering that we can have, the direct experience that we can have, dukkha vedana, which is sometimes called dukkha. And then there's also the dukkha of change, of the fact that even when we're experiencing joy, there's always the possibility coming round the corner, as you like, from suffering. You're never that far away. And Bhante's also even making the point that which gives us joy will also lead to our suffering. So because of change, suffering and joy are bound up with each other. It's that feeling of going on your annual holiday and knowing it's going to end, and that's bound up within it. I had the most perfect day on holiday recently on a beach, on a sunny day in Scotland. This beautiful beach overlooking the islands of Lewis and Harris and Skye. A perfect day, and yet within that experience was the knowledge that we had to leave the next day, and it was there all the time. So it's that kind of suffering, the suffering of change. And then also he talks about the suffering of existence itself, in a way dukkha is one of the lakshanas, that there exists within the non-enlightened experience a sense that there'll always be this seed of it's not quite enough. It's not quite enough to satisfy the longings of the human heart. The way he talks about it is the whole of phenomenal existence, from its highest to its lowest plane, is either actually or potentially painful. I think I'd expand this to say it's what the Buddha calls Sankhara dukkha, which is the dukkha of formations, the dukkha of always kind of bringing oneself into existence and not being enlightened will always give you a sense of dukkha. So there are these forms of dukkha that we reflect on, and it's important to sort of work out within oneself, how is it useful to reflect on dukkha? How do we usefully reflect on suffering in our lives? We don't have to look for suffering will occur. So how can we look at it usefully? And I suppose the answer within this chapter is that to look at it usefully, you have to draw out this general teaching of Praticca Samutpada. So there's dukkha, but then there's also the cause of dukkha, which is tanha or trishna, looking for satisfaction, longing for satisfaction, wanting something, but looking in the wrong places. And just remembering in our minds that it is only by tanha that tanha is overcome. It's only by craving for enlightenment that craving for existence and non-existence and sensory pleasures can be overcome. And then we have this really, I really love this bit where Sangharakshita talks about the third noble truth, as with the cessation of craving comes a cessation of suffering. But he makes this really important point, which is that it's not just about getting rid of suffering. Enlightenment is much more than that. And there's a classic quote from the survey, which is, "Not for our own sake, nor even for the sake of others, should one seek to attain the divine, but simply and solely for its own irresistible sake." So yes, there's the removal of suffering, which is really, really important. But there's also the removal of suffering is because something much bigger has come into being, something much more positive. And Sangharakshita says, yes, we talk about the Four Noble Truths as sort of an existence of a problem, how the problem is conditioned, what the removal of the problem what would happen if we removed the condition for the problem, so the removal of the problem, and then the way leading to the removal of the problem. But there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to talk about the Four Noble Truths as something positive, like liberation, and what are the causes for liberation, and on what condition does liberation can arise, and what is the way leading to liberation. You know, there's no sort of reason why we couldn't talk about the Four Noble Truths as bringing something positive into being. You could even look at it like the Brahma Viharas, or positive states of mind, wisdom. How could wisdom, what are the conditions for wisdom coming into being? On what does wisdom depend? With the arising of what does wisdom arise? And what is the path leading to wisdom? So there's no reason why we couldn't talk about it in positive terms. It's just that in this example, we're talking about dukkha and the removal of dukkha, and with the ceasing of craving, dukkha ceases. But we can envisage the ceasing of dukkha in a much broader sense. And then he goes through the way leading to the cessation of dukkha, leading to the way leading to the cessation of craving, of tanha, which leads to the ceasing of dukkha. And I won't go into those stages because he said quite a lot about them in other places. One could look at the lecture series he has on the Noble Eightfold Path. There's just one thing that I wanted to draw your attention to in this chapter that sometimes gets a little bit overlooked, which is the section on refined hedonism. I think sometimes in the West we can, maybe in other countries, other places in the world, maybe it's universal, but we can sometimes sort of make dukkha a little bit more okay for us by saying it's because of the transitory nature of things that makes them more satisfying. So refined hedonism. He talks about refined hedonism, which for example, death gives a keener aspect to joy. Maybe I'll read that quote to you. He says, one exceptionally deep in love with life will find that it is the sweeter for its transitoriness, that death gives a keener edge to joy. So yes, in a way what that's encouraging in us is a kind of refined form of hedonism where we seek to attain more pleasure, but it's pleasure that's based on an understanding of impermanence, for example. We love something even the more because it's going to fade. We love something even the more though it's going to die. I think that's there's something in that, and we can get into those states. But I think it's also important not to get lost in them. It's important to realise that yes, it also means that there's something beyond. There's something beyond even loving something even more because it's impermanent. I remember going round an antique shop and seeing things that were very, very beautiful. A lot of kind of Japanese antiques that are beautiful because they're worn, because they've got that kind of element of bringing us closer to the sort of impermanent nature of reality. And I could feel myself getting really sucked into wanting more of those things. So yes, I wanted to draw your attention to that section on refined hedonism. And what is refined hedonism? Refined hedonism is loving something even the more because you can see it's expressive of reality, particularly the reality of impermanence. And Bhante he discusses that with a kind of warning, and the warning is that actually one can become more attached to the pleasures of samsara because they're impermanent. And that actually, in a way, the whole point of reflection on dukkha is to go forth from samsara into the greater bliss of nirvana, into the greater bliss of liberation. So refined hedonism is, in a way, it's a step up from crude hedonism, but it's a terrible place to end, because really reflection on dukkha aims to free us from samsara, not to just refine our experience of samsara. So that's something that you may want to look into and discuss in your groups. But I think the main message is to, yes, reflect on dukkha and help dukkha to not lead you further round the wheel, but in reflecting on dukkha can help us understand more deeply the truth about reality, and more deeply how to free ourselves from suffering and to help other people to free themselves from suffering also.